Beneath the surface of Australia sit chambers that were never carved by water or wind, but by fire, ancient volcanic tunnels, sealed lava tubes, and craters that have never been fully mapped. Some are still considered structurally unstable. Others have never been fully explored at all. This is what's actually sitting underneath the parts of this country most people assume are simply empty. Nobody has ever reached the end of Cocklebiddy Cave. Not because nobody's tried. Divers have been pushing into its flooded passages since 1961, using better equipment every decade, breaking world records for how far a human being has ever swum underground. And every single expedition has stopped for the same reason. Not because the cave ended, because the diver's air, equipment, or body gave out first. Hundreds of kilometres away, in a separate but connected story of Australian cave diving, 13 people never made it out of the water at all. A landscape built to trap anyone who goes looking. The Nullarbor Plain sits on the largest single area of limestone bedrock anywhere on Earth. From the surface, driving the Eyre Highway, it looks like nothing, flat, treeless country stretching to the horizon in every direction. Underneath it is an entirely different story. Millions of years of slightly acidic groundwater dissolving the limestone from below have produced a network of flooded cave systems, subterranean lakes, and passages that extend deeper into the rock than any team of divers has yet managed to follow to their end. Cocklebiddy Cave is the most famous of these systems. Its entrance is a collapsed doline, a sinkhole formed when part of the cave roof caved in, exposing a chamber system below that opens into an entrance room more than 300 metres long. From there, the cave descends into water, crystal clear water, 180 metres of open lake, before the passage narrows into a flooded tunnel that continues for more than 6 kilometres underground. Divers who've been inside have described the water as so clear it feels like floating in air rather than swimming. The silence beyond the entrance chamber closed to absolute. The cave has been closed to public access since the early 2010s due to unstable rock at the entrance. You can walk down into the doline and look at the threshold. You cannot go past a barrier erected a short distance inside. What's past that barrier is something almost nobody on Earth will ever personally see. 60 years of expeditions that all end the same way. The first dive into Cocklebiddy was completed in 1961 by members of the Western Australia Speleological Group, who penetrated 200 metres before their equipment limitations forced them back. Over the following 2 decades, successive expeditions pushed further in, each one benefiting from slightly better technology than the last. The cave passed through multiple chambers separated by flooded sections, including a dry, air-filled space explorers named Toad Hall, 250 metres long and 10 metres high, sitting kilometres into the system where no natural light has ever reached and no sound from the surface can penetrate. In August 1983, a French team set a world record, completing the longest underwater cave penetration ever attempted at the time, pushing more than 6 kilometres from the entrance. 2 months later, an Australian team broke that same record. A South Australian diver extended it again in 1995. In 2008, Craig Challen and Richard Harris, divers who would later become household names in Australia for their roles in the 2018 Thai cave rescue, used rebreather technology to map and film sections of the cave that had never been documented before. At the end of every single one of these record-setting dives, the passage kept going. It has always kept going. Nobody has yet reached the back of Cocklebiddy Cave. Every expedition in over 60 years has stopped, not because the cave came to an end, but because the divers' equipment, air supply, or physical limits ran out first. The danger that isn't hypothetical. It would be one thing if Cocklebiddy's difficulty were purely theoretical, a cave that's simply very long and very deep. It isn't. Cave diving in this specific style of flooded limestone system carries a documented, well-established fatality risk, one that Australia's own cave diving history has confirmed repeatedly. In incidents largely unrelated to Cocklebiddy itself, but shaped by exactly the same conditions: sediment-clouded water, narrow passages, and total darkness far from any surface exit. Between 1969 and 1983, 13 divers died in freshwater cave diving accidents in Australia, across 6 separate incidents concentrated in the Mount Gambier region of South Australia, a limestone karst area with its own network of flooded sinkholes and cave systems, geologically related to the broader story of how water moves through this kind of rock across southern Australia. The most significant of these was the 1973 Mount Gambier cave diving accident at a site known as the Shaft. 4 divers went in to explore beyond the cave's already mapped sections. They went further than their training or equipment could safely support, entered without a properly maintained guideline back to the entrance, became disoriented in the dark, and drowned after their air supply ran out before they could find their way back to the surface. Their bodies were recovered over the following year, one at a time, in an operation that shaped Australian cave diving safety practice for the next 50 years. That tragedy led directly to the formation of the Cave Divers Association of Australia in 1973, which introduced the mandatory guidelines, buddy systems, and formal training standards that now govern every legal cave dive conducted in the country. It's a direct causal line: 13 deaths, 6 incidents, and a national governing body created specifically because Australia's flooded cave systems had proven repeatedly that experience and enthusiasm alone weren't enough to guarantee anyone made it back out. The danger hasn't stayed in the past either. In November 2025, a 65-year-old experienced diver named Gary Gibson died at Tank Cave near Mount Gambier, with his body recovered by police divers, including Richard Harris, the same diver whose name appears earlier in Cocklebiddy's own exploration history, and who would go on to become globally known for his role in the Tem Luang cave rescue in Thailand. Why the deaths and the discoveries are the same story. It's worth being precise about the geography here. Cocklebiddy Cave and the Mount Gambier fatalities occurred in different cave systems, hundreds of kilometres apart, one on the Nullarbor near the Western Australia and South Australia border, the other in South Australia's southeast. They are not the same physical cave. What connects them is something more fundamental: the same underlying limestone karst geology, the same category of extreme risk, and in Richard Harris's case, literally the same individuals moving between mapping the frontier of one system and recovering bodies from the other. This is what makes the phrase "killed every team sent to map it" more than just a dramatic framing device. Every record-setting expedition into Cockle has been undertaken by divers operating in the exact same conditions, the same total darkness, the same narrow flooded passages, the same total dependence on air supply and a guideline back to safety that killed 13 people in a genuinely comparable Australian cave system a few decades earlier. The divers who've pushed Cockle record further in 1983, in 1995, in 2008, weren't operating in some separate, safer category of cave exploration. They were doing the same activity in the same kind of environment that Australia's own cave diving history has already proven can and does kill experienced, well-trained people who make even a single serious mistake. What's actually down there? The cave system beneath the Nullarbor wasn't always flooded. During periods when global sea levels were significantly lower, these passages were dry, and the limestone cast of the Nullarbor would have contained accessible caves, underground freshwater sources, and genuine shelter from the brutal conditions of the plain above. The Mearning people, traditional custodians of this country, maintain a documented ceremonial connection to a waterhole near the modern Nullarbor settlement, and their oral tradition reflects deep knowledge of the subterranean water sources that made survival possible in one of the driest environments on Earth. In the dry sections of Nullarbor cave systems, archaeologists have found evidence of ancient Aboriginal habitation, stone tools and animal bones deposited in chambers that were accessible on foot before rising groundwater and changing sea levels sealed them off entirely. The people who left those objects lived in a landscape that looked nothing like the Nullarbor looks today, in caves that were open, in passages that were dry. What now requires specialist cave diving equipment, years of technical training, and a documented history of fatal incidents to access was, tens of thousands of years ago, simply underground country that people knew, used and understood without any of it being remarkable at all. That knowledge, and the culture that carried it, was disrupted by the same colonial processes that reached every part of Australia. The specific ceremonial and practical understanding connected to these cave systems was not systematically documented before significant parts of it were lost, meaning much of what these caves meant to the people who first lived alongside them may be permanently unrecoverable, in a way no amount of modern cave diving technology can retrieve. What remains unknown? The Nullarbor cast contains thousands of individual cave systems. A small number have been explored by divers. The overwhelming majority have not been entered at all, either because they remain flooded at the surface, because their entrances haven't yet been found, or because the sheer scale of the plain has made any kind of systematic survey an undertaking nobody has ever fully resourced. What exists in the unexplored sections of the cave system beneath one of the most remote, least visited stretches of country in Australia is a question that nobody currently has the ability to answer. The cave is closed. The entrances are unmarked. The water is 6 kilometres of flooded passage, so clear it looks like air. And every serious attempt to find out what's past the furthest point anyone has ever reached has ended the same way it did in 1961, in 1983, in 1995, and in 2008. Not with an answer, but with a diver forced to turn back, air running low, in a system that has already proven, in a related cave a few hundred kilometres away, Exactly what happens to people who push past the point their equipment and training can actually support. Somewhere past the last confirmed metre of Cocklebiddy Cave, sitting in absolute darkness at the end of 6 kilometres of tunnel beneath the Nullarbor, whatever's actually down there is exactly where it's always been. Let's talk about something interesting. Underneath the dry savanna woodland of far north Queensland, hidden beneath grevillea and eucalyptus that look identical to 1,000 other stretches of outback, there is a network of tunnels large enough to drive 2 double-decker buses through side by side. It has been there for almost 200,000 years, and parts of it have still never been fully mapped. This is Undara, home to the longest lava tube system on Earth, and if this is your first time on Lost Australia, welcome. Make sure you are subscribed, because we cover places exactly like this every single week, sites that sit quietly beneath the surface of this country, while almost nobody realises what is actually down there. Around 190,000 years ago, in what geologists classify as the Cainozoic era, the Undara volcano erupted in an event so violent it remains one of the largest single volcanic flows ever recorded on the planet. Molten rock, reaching temperatures of around 1,200 degrees Celsius, poured out of the volcano at a rate of roughly 1,000 cubic metres every single second. Over the course of the eruption, an estimated 23.3 cubic kilometres of lava flowed outward, enough, according to Queensland's own park authorities, to fill Sydney Harbour completely in just 6 days. The lava travelled more than 90 kilometres to the north and over 160 kilometres to the northwest, making it one of the longest lava flows ever produced by a single volcano anywhere in the world. What makes Undara different from a typical volcanic eruption is not just its scale, but the specific way it left the landscape behind. As the lava surged along old, pre-existing watercourses, the outer surface, exposed to the air, cooled and hardened relatively quickly, forming a solid crust. Underneath that crust, insulated from the cooling air above, the molten lava kept flowing for tens of kilometres more, carving its own path through the hardened shell that had formed around it. When the eruption eventually stopped and the remaining lava drained away, it left behind exactly what that process implies. Long, hollow, cave-like tunnels running for enormous distances beneath the surface, some of them wide and tall enough to feel less like a cave and more like an underground cathedral. The Awamian people, the traditional custodians of this stretch of savanna country, knew portions of the lava tube network long before any Europeans set foot in the region, though according to the accounts passed down through early contact with settlers. They kept a deliberate distance from them rather than making regular use of the tubes themselves. It would take European cattlemen, arriving decades later, to bring the tunnels into wider written record. In 1862, brothers from the Collins family settled the surrounding land, establishing what would become a large pastoral run across the area now occupied by the national park. The lava tubes themselves were well recognised locally by 1891, appearing in written accounts as a curious geological feature on the property, though for close to a century afterward, they received only occasional, unmanaged visits from anyone curious enough to climb down and take a look. It was not until 1989 that formal guided tours began, and the land was eventually declared Undara Volcanic National Park, with the Collins family granted a special lease to continue operating tourism on the site they had lived alongside for generations. Even with tourism established, the full extent of the tube system has never been completely mapped. During a major expedition in the late 1980s, known as Operation Raleigh, researchers identified 68 separate caves within the wider system. Bram Collins, a descendant of the original settling family and longtime operator of the tourism experience at Undara, personally discovered an entirely new cave as recently as 1992, a full century after the tubes were first written into the historical record. To this day, the true total extent of the network beneath the park remains unknown, with researchers regularly acknowledging that portions of the system have likely never been entered by anyone at all. If you are finding this as strange as I do, make sure you are subscribed, because what lives inside these tunnels is arguably even more remarkable than the tunnels themselves. Before we get into that, I want to mention something that ties directly into stories like this one. I put together an ebook called The Timeline Lie, covering 15 documented sites across every Australian state where peer-reviewed research has quietly rewritten the history most of us were taught in school, evidence that is decades old, fully verified, and still barely known outside academic circles. If a place like Undara genuinely surprises you, that book goes even deeper into the parts of this country most people were never given the full picture on. The link is below this video if you would like to take a look. The single strangest cave within the entire Undara system is Bayless Cave, and its significance has nothing to do with size and everything to do with what scientists found living inside it. When researchers first properly surveyed the cave's internal atmosphere in the 1980s, they discovered something that should not, by ordinary logic, be able to sustain life at all. Deep inside Bayless Cave, beyond a low, narrow section known to researchers as the Duck Under, carbon dioxide levels climb to around 6% of the total atmosphere, roughly 200 times higher than the concentration found in ordinary outside air. As carbon dioxide increases, oxygen correspondingly drops, and humidity inside the deeper sections regularly reaches full saturation, with water actively condensing on the cave walls. By any conventional expectation, an environment like that should be close to sterile, hostile to almost everything except the most basic microbial life. Instead, Bayless Cave turned out to be one of the most biologically rich cave systems ever documented anywhere in the world. Researchers have recorded dozens of species of cave-adapted invertebrates living permanently within its depths, animals scientifically classified as troglobionts, meaning they are so specifically adapted to life underground that they cannot survive anywhere else. Among them are two separate species of blind cockroach, an eyeless cave cricket found nowhere else on Earth, several species of blind, cave-adapted spiders, and an entire genus of weevil, formerly named Underobius, after the site itself, so distinct from every other known weevil lineage in Australia that researchers studying it could not confidently place it within any existing group. When the site was first properly documented in the late 1980s, it was recognised as one of the 20 richest known cave invertebrate communities in the entire world. And ongoing research since then has continued adding to that species list. A comprehensive survey published in 2021 recorded a minimum of 78 distinct arthropod species across the wider Undara cave network, a significant number of which remain formally undescribed by science to this day, existing in the scientific record only as specimens waiting for someone to properly classify them. What makes this ecosystem particularly strange is the question of what is actually powering it. In an ordinary cave ecosystem, energy typically enters from outside, carried in by bats, water, or organic debris washed in from the surface. Researchers studying the elevated carbon dioxide levels deep inside Bayless Cave have pointed to several possible biogenic sources, including the respiration of tree roots that penetrate down through cracks in the rock, the cave's substantial bat population, and the invertebrate community itself. But the exact balance of what sustains such an unusually dense, isolated food web this far from the surface has never been fully resolved. The bats themselves add another layer to the story. Baker's Cave, part of the wider network, serves as a major maternity roost for several species of insectivorous microbat, with populations estimated at times to include as many as 80,000 individual bats during the breeding season, one of the largest such colonies anywhere in North Queensland. Where there are that many bats roosting in a confined space, predators inevitably follow. Brown tree snakes have been documented moving through the tubes in numbers, drawn by the sheer density of prey overhead, turning sections of the cave into an active, self-contained predator and prey system playing out entirely in the dark, far from any daylight. Above ground, the tubes have left their mark on the landscape in a different, more subtle way. Running for roughly 40 kilometres across the park is a raised snake-like feature known locally as the Wall, standing between 5 and 20 metres high and roughly 200 metres wide, believed by researchers to sit directly above one of the buried lava tube conduits that once carried molten rock along a former stream course. It is one of the more visible surface clues to the scale of what runs beneath the ground. A long, low ridge tracing the exact path where a river of lava once flowed, insulated inside its own hardened shell, for a length most visitors driving past would never think twice about. There is one more geological detail that sets Undara apart from almost every other lava tube system studied anywhere in the world. Most lava tubes form on top of older volcanic rock, layer built upon layer over successive eruptions. Undara's tubes instead developed directly on top of a granitic basement, an unusual foundation for a lava flow of this scale, making the system not just the longest of its kind, but structurally distinct in a way researchers still reference when comparing it to other lava tube networks internationally. Combined with its length, its age, and the sheer volume of lava involved in its formation, Undara is frequently described by geologists as one of the most significant volcanic landforms anywhere on the continent, sitting almost entirely unnoticed beneath ordinary-looking savanna country that gives away nothing of what lies beneath it. What Undara ultimately represents is not one single unsolved mystery in the way some of the sites we cover on this channel are, but a landscape where the unresolved details keep accumulating the deeper anyone looks. A tube system so extensive that new caves are still being found more than a century after the first one was documented. An underground chamber with an atmosphere that should be nearly lifeless, instead supporting one of the richest cave ecosystems ever recorded, sustained by an energy source scientists still cannot fully account for. And an entire genus of insect found nowhere else on the planet, quietly living out its existence in total darkness, in a tunnel carved by lava that stopped moving before modern humans had even reached this part of the world. Somewhere beneath that ordinary looking stretch of Queensland savanna, the tunnels are still there, largely unmapped, still hiding new caves, and still supporting a community of life that has evolved entirely in the dark, waiting for the next person willing to climb down and take a proper look. There's something in the north of Queensland, folks, and I need to talk about it. So, in 1972, a linguist working in far north Queensland sat down with Aboriginal elders to record a story that had been passed down for generations. A story about two young men, a broken taboo, and a furious rainbow serpent that tore the earth open beneath an entire camp of people. Decades later, geologists studying the exact same site drilled into the ground and pulled up sediment that told them something extraordinary. The story was not myth dressed up as memory. It was a genuine eyewitness account of a volcanic eruption, and it had been kept alive accurately for close to 10,000 years. If this is your first time on Lost Australia, welcome, and make sure you are subscribed, because we cover places exactly like this every single week. Sites where the official record and the oldest living memory in this country turn out to be describing the exact same thing. The lakes in question sit on the Atherton Tablelands in far north Queensland, roughly 40 kilometres south of Cairns. Lake Acomb, Lake Barine and Lake Yuramu are known to geologists as Mars, a specific and relatively rare type of volcanic crater, formed not by a mountain building up over time, but by a sudden, violent explosion, triggered when rising magma meets groundwater and flashes it instantly into steam. The resulting blast does not create a peak at all. It blows a crater straight down into the earth, and once the eruption ends, that crater slowly fills with water, leaving behind a lake with no visible connection to the volcanic violence that created it. Today, all three lakes look almost impossibly peaceful, sitting inside dense, ancient rainforest. Their waters are deep, still blue, home to freshwater turtles, platypus, and towering fig trees growing right to the water's edge. Lake Acomb reaches a depth of around 65 metres and has no streams flowing in or out of it at all, relying entirely on rainfall and losing water only through evaporation and soakage into the surrounding rock. A closed, self-contained system that can fluctuate by several metres between wet and dry seasons. Nearby Lake Barine is larger still, roughly a kilometre across, and Lake Yuramu sits as the smallest of the group, tucked into the same volcanic province. For a long time, the specific age of these craters was known only in the broadest possible terms, understood to be part of a wider volcanic field, active from the Miocene through to the more recent Holocene period. It was only through detailed sediment core analysis, drilling straight down through the layers of mud and ash settled at the bottom of each lake, that researchers were able to pin down more exact dates. Lake Akam's Ma eruption is now dated to a little over 9,000 years ago. Lake Barine, the larger of the two major lakes, formed earlier still, somewhere between 15 and 17,000 years in the past. None of that dating work would have meant much on its own, if not for what was already sitting in the oral record of the Ngajon, Ji and Yidinji peoples, the traditional custodians of this exact stretch of country. According to the story, as recorded from multiple tellers across different decades, two newly initiated young men broke a taboo, forbidding them from hunting before their initiation was properly complete. While digging for witchetty grubs at the base of a tree considered sacred, they angered Yamini, the rainbow serpent, one of the most powerful and feared figures across a great deal of Aboriginal spiritual tradition throughout the continent. What followed, according to the account, was described in specific, almost forensic physical detail. The ground beneath the camp began to shake and roar like thunder. A wind swept down as though a cyclone were approaching. The earth itself twisted and cracked open, and even though the event occurred in the middle of the day, the sky turned a deep, blackish red, a colour witnesses said they had never seen before. Then the ground gave way entirely, and the camp, along with the people in it, was swallowed into the earth. Read as pure mythology, that story sounds like exactly what you would expect. A dramatic morality tale about respecting sacred law wrapped around a supernatural punishment. Read against the geological record, it becomes something else entirely. A wind sweeping down before the eruption. A rumbling, roaring ground. A cracking, twisting earth. A sky turning an unnatural reddish black. And a specific location where the people camped, becoming permanently a body of water. Every one of those details lines up precisely with what modern volcanology understands about how a phreatomagmatic Ma eruption actually behaves. An event Aboriginal communities in this region had no scientific vocabulary to describe, yet somehow preserved with startling physical accuracy across roughly 400 generations. Before we go further into what this means more broadly, I want to mention something that ties directly into a discovery like this one. I put together an ebook called The Timeline Lie, covering 15 documented sites across every Australian state where peer-reviewed research has quietly rewritten the history most of us were taught in school. Evidence that is decades old, fully verified, and still barely known outside academic circles. If a story like this genuinely surprises you, that book goes even deeper into the parts of this country's past that were never properly explained to the public. The link is below this video if you would like to take a look. What makes this case particularly significant is that it is not an isolated example. Researchers studying Aboriginal oral tradition across the country have identified a growing pattern of stories that appear to encode real, physically verifiable events stretching back much further than oral history was traditionally assumed capable of preserving. Separate studies have found Aboriginal accounts that accurately reflect sea level changes occurring over the past 10,000 years, describing coastlines and landmarks that have since been swallowed by rising water, exactly where geological evidence says they should have existed. In other cases, stories describing objects falling from the sky have led researchers directly to previously undocumented meteorite impact sites, oral tradition effectively functioning as a map toward physical evidence nobody else had thought to look for. If you are finding this as remarkable as I do, make sure you are subscribed, because there is a deeper implication here that reaches well beyond 3 crater lakes in far north Queensland. For most of the 20th century, oral tradition was treated by much of Western academia as inherently unreliable, assumed to drift, distort, and embellish with each retelling until any original factual core became impossible to separate from accumulated myth. The Akim, Barine, and Yuramu stories challenge that assumption directly. This is not a case where a single vague detail happens to loosely match a known geological event. It is a story carrying multiple, specific, independently verifiable physical details, a pre-eruption wind, ground level shaking, an unusual sky colour, and a precise final outcome, matched against sediment dating that places the actual eruption at Lake Akim at a little over 9,000 years before present. An oral record stretching back that far, verified by physical science, rather than simply assumed to be symbolic, sits far outside what most historical and anthropological frameworks were built to expect from a purely spoken tradition. The lakes themselves remain protected today within Crater Lakes National Park, part of the broader wet tropics of Queensland World Heritage Area. And to a modern visitor walking the rainforest paths around Lake Akim, nothing about the water's calm surface suggests any of this history at all. Cassowaries move through the surrounding forest. Musky rat kangaroos, an unusually primitive marsupial species found almost nowhere else, forage in the undergrowth during daylight hours, a rarity among Australian marsupials. The whole scene reads as untouched, ancient rainforest, exactly the kind of place a visitor might photograph without a second thought about what the ground beneath their feet actually did and when. What sits underneath these 3 lakes then is not really a single unsolved mystery in the way some sites on this channel present one. It is closer to a genuine collision between 2 entirely different systems of recording history. One built on drilled sediment cores and radiocarbon dating, the other built on memory, retelling, and a taboo about a sacred tree, both arriving independently at the same violent morning 9,000 years ago, when the ground opened and swallowed an entire camp of people whole. It is worth being clear that not every Aboriginal story tied to a natural landmark carries this same kind of precise, independently verified physical detail, and researchers studying these traditions are careful not to treat every piece of oral history as a literal geological transcript waiting to be decoded. What sets the Akim, Barine, and Yuramu accounts apart is the sheer specificity involved. Multiple independent physical details lining up with multiple independent scientific findings across 3 separate lakes, each with its own distinct version of the story, matched to its own distinct eruption date. That level of consistency is what elevates this particular case from an interesting coincidence into something researchers now treat as a genuine, serious example of deep time oral history, one of the clearest on record anywhere in the world. Lake Barine carries a version of the same story, adapted to its own slightly different timeline and scale. Formed between 15 and 17,000 years ago, considerably earlier than its neighbour, Barrien's eruption appears to have been larger and more extensive, consistent with what geologists describe as an overall progression across this volcanic province, moving from larger, more powerful eruptions in its earlier phases toward smaller, more localised events as the underlying magma system gradually lost intensity over thousands of years. That geological progression, tracked purely through physical evidence in the rock and sediment, lines up with a broader pattern researchers have noticed across the oral traditions associated with each lake. Variations in scale and intensity between the stories that roughly mirror the actual difference in size and violence between the eruptions that created them. Lake Uramu, the smallest of the three, holds its own version of the story as well. This one centred on the same rainbow serpent figure, Yamini, growing angry and punishing those responsible. Sediment cores pulled from Uramu have offered researchers something beyond just eruption dating too. Basal layers from the lake revealed evidence of a considerably drier climate during the early Holocene, showing hardier, drought-tolerant vegetation growing in the area long before the dense, wet rainforest visitors see today ever took hold. That finding lines up, again, with Aboriginal accounts describing a period of more open country in this same region long ago, oral tradition and sediment science independently pointing toward the same environmental history, layered on top of the eruption story itself.